Quotations from myself, segment 74, quotation number 907. Perhaps the most appreciated benefit of a friendship is having someone to listen sympathetically to complaints about ill luck undeservedly befallen us. Because of this, it is wise to choose friends whose lifestyle, financial, personal situation closely resembles ours. Otherwise, how, for example, the one who has made only $90,000 last year instead of the usual $100,000 can complain about such a terrible misfortune too, and expect to elicit empathy from a friend whose only source of income during the same year was unemployment insurance checks. 908. You will always have poor people with you. Matthew 26:11. This statement, unfortunately, is as true today as 2,000 years ago, when it was first made. For it is apparently impossible to create a society of real material equality. There will always be people who have more, and consequently those who have less, and not just less, but very little indeed. Now, taking the inequality as a given, the practical question is how much inequality can any particular society have without endangering its very existence? Or, in other words, how many poor and how poor they must be to cause the edifice of civic order to crumble? It is hard to give the precise answer to that, since at different times and in different places it will be different. Some countries can have more than half of its population living in abject poverty and still function. Others would probably collapse well before reaching this stage. Then again, poverty comes in different sizes and shapes. There is absolute poverty, when the very biological existence of human being cannot be sustained. And there is relative poverty, when some group of society consume many times less than others. But no matter how varied poverty is, there is always such a critical, though hard to define point, when the quantity of poverty triggers suddenly qualitative change, and the state explodes in violence and anarchy. Because of this, the more important, and certainly without belittling the struggle for more equality, the more immediate task any government has is to prevent reaching such a point of no return. In the recent history after 1929, all socio-economic policy in the West has been influenced by this threat. Of course, there are those who think that under such a catastrophic scenario, the poor, to paraphrase the Marx, have nothing to lose by their poverty, which, as catchy as it is may sound, has been proven by history not to be always true. For death and destruction are what most of the people, most of the time, find worse than poverty. That is why the revolution is so rare. For a first and certain result of revolution is just that, death and destruction, while the hope for a better life may never be obtained. The all-pervasive fear of such a tragic outcome is so deeply ingrained in the minds of ordinary people that the shrewd rulers should always play on it. And here is another Machiavellian advice to powers that be. One thing no state should do if it wants to maintain its stability, law and order, is to allow its soldiers and policemen to fall into poverty. It is absolutely imperative that they paid well enough to see themselves as a part of the class whose prosperity and security they defend. Though ultimately it can't prevent the collapse of the state when the objective conditions are right for this, but only prolong and make it bloodier. 909. For a desert dweller, the disappearance of a single tree is as noticeable as that of 1,000 for the one who lives in a forest. For a poor man, losing $1 is as significant as that of 100 for one who is well off. For a parent, the death of an only child is as devastating as that of all for one who has several. It isn't the absolute amount of the loss, but how great a portion it was of what we had that determines how great the pain caused by it. And for the one who has next to nothing, losing even that little means losing everything. 910. Because of the unprecedented number of people moving around the world nowadays, leaving their own and settling in somebody else's country, the nostalgia has become so rampant that there seems to be a need to form a new self-help organization, Nostalgic Anonymous, where the Italians, Greeks, Russians, Jamaicans, etc. immigrants get together and help each other to overcome this debilitatingly seductive addiction. 911. In the popular science fiction TV series Star Trek, people are transported from one spaceship to another by first being analyzed into subatomic particles and then beamed up through the space and finally sensitized at the point of arrival back into a whole person. But sometimes the transportation device malfunctions and people get stuck in the outer space as a bunch of separate particles and can neither return to their own ship nor to get to the new one. The experience of some immigrants is very similar to that. They leave their own country but can't get to the new ones and seems to be forever stuck in between. 912. The question to which I think I have got the answer, or better still nobody else but me has, I consider to be of paramount importance. Otherwise it is irrelevant. 913. Nowadays, when I walk down the street and see something exciting happening, I don't even stop to gape at it anymore. It is going to be later on TV anyway, and it's better colors than that. So why to waste my time twice? 914. The majority of car accidents on the big city streets are caused not by drivers' incompetence, but the appalling lack of elementary courtesy. 915. Quite often the translation, especially of some philosophical writing, are more intelligible than the originals, where a translator feels an obligation to turn the occasional rambling of the philosopher, which is unfortunately too common in this type of writing, into a coherent discourse, if for nothing else than to spare the reader the difficulties and bewilderment he had experienced himself. 916. Anyone who tries to write honestly about his experience, thoughts and feelings, as most poets do or are expected to do, is bound to find his writing and himself under the inquisitive microscope of relatives, friends and acquaintances, who will undoubtedly recognize himself as some of the sources and causes of poet's opinion and sentiments. Hence, such a candid writing has a strong potential to create a lot of misunderstanding, or even worse, too much of understanding, leading inevitably to tension and discomfort, and not necessarily of creative kind, in a writer's personal life. But what else a poet should write about, if not about what he knows best? And one unquestionably knows best the people closest to him, that is, his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. And how one can completely avoid to reveal what must be literally seeping through the pores of his emotional and intellectual beings, no matter how much of obfuscation, equivocation, metaphorizing, allegorizing, etc., all such and many more wonderful devices, verbal devices invented to conceal and disguise the simple truth, are employed for the sake of poet's social self-preservation. Perhaps the slipping into the fictional world of fantasy and reality is one of the answers. Or, as some famous writers have done, to record one's genuine thought and feeling in a secret diary or memoirs, with a strict instruction to deposit them after his death into a bank safe to be opened 50 years later, when everyone concerned are dead. But what a terrible fate to permit oneself to have a true spiritual life only 50 years after one's own physical death. And what an unbearable constraint the poet has to live under, to be able to see more and yet to be permitted to say less than the rest of us. For it seems to be as immutable as the law of nature. One cannot write honestly without endangering the relationship with those around him, and thus cannot escape the necessity of making a choice between truth and peace. What a cruel dilemma to be faced with when one sits down to write. 9:17. Being an eccentric is the only form of social protest the polite society allows to an individual. 918. The arrogant ones are actually more socially acceptable than those who do not take themselves seriously, and as a result tend not to take seriously anybody else. And who likes that? 9:19. First, one has to decide what kind of life one would like to have, and only after that to choose, provided of course there are choices possible, the place where the probability of having it seems to be the greatest. And though it may sound like one of those tiresome common sense platitudes, many have ruined their lives by turning these self-evident propositions upside down.